So Tamil Nadu, as you know, is committed to creating a thriving ecosystem for the semiconductor sector with focused efforts to promote semiconductor design. This session, Semiconductors, the value chain imperative for building leadership, will focus on key drivers to trigger and foster large-scale opportunities within the semiconductor value chain. This apart, at the Tamil Nadu Global Investors Meet 2024, every session is also a celebration of knowledge. We have curated a terrific lineup of exceptional speakers who will deep dive and give us perspective on what it takes to be a global semiconductor hub. So we begin with the fireside chat, and our moderator for this session has more than 3 decades of experience in media, policy, regulatory, corporate issues, and political affairs. Mr. Rahul Sharma, Managing Director, APCO Worldwide, will moderate this session. And our guest for the fireside chat, as you know, is Professor Chris Miller, an expert in international politics, economics, and technology, and the author of Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology. The book, Chip War, won the Financial Times Best Business Book of the Year award and was described by the New York Times as a non-fiction thriller. Put your hands together as I invite this terrific team on stage. Can we give them a nice big round of applause and kickstart the fireside chat? Over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I hope some of you have had lunch. And if you have, you are suitably awake. It's one of those, scary part of doing post-lunch sessions is that you got to keep it extra interesting. And I can assure you that Chris is here with us, and it's wonderful to have you, Chris. And I don't know how many of you have read his book, Chip War. Came out at a really opportune time. And I got my copy soon after it came out, and I just loved reading it because the kind of insights and history that you read about and how well it got connected to what was happening in the world at that point in time when the book was launched was just an amazing experience. So it's great to have you here. We have about, I think, 25 minutes. So I want to keep time because I know the previous session went on for a bit longer, which has delayed a lot of other things. So I've been asked to keep time. And then I'll just have a few questions for Chris, and then we can open it up for a Q&A. I presume you will have questions, and Chris will have answers. All right? So welcome, Chris. I'll just very quickly start. So the other interesting part about Chris is that he actually teaches history, geopolitics, and he's also an expert on everything Russia. So before Chip War, he has written 3 other books, largely focused on Soviet Union. There's one book called Putinomics, which talks about the economics of Vladimir Putin, and 2 others which make for interesting reading. So if anybody's interested in what's happening with Russia and want to understand why is it happening, I think it'll be a good idea to read his books on that. But let me quickly start with a few questions. And where did that go? Sorry. Let me just bring that out. Okay. So the book came out just as the world was quite shattered with COVID, right? Supply chain became a big issue, everything shut down. So what has changed since?
Well, I think there are 3 big things that have changed in the world of semiconductors. One is that because of the supply chain issues that the entire world faced during the pandemic, manufacturing companies in India, in China, in the US, in Europe, they all realized that today all manufacturing requires semiconductors. Whether it's cars or planes or medical devices or construction equipment, there are chips inside of those devices, and there's not just a handful, there's often dozens or hundreds of chips. And every year that passes, we put more and more semiconductors in our devices. And so the first thing that's happened is that manufacturers realize that whatever you're making, you require semiconductors, which means you need to understand where are your supply chains and how do they work. That's the first thing. The second thing is that AI has happened. AI has happened in a big way. And the advances in AI that we've seen, not just over the past year with the release of ChatGPT, but actually over the past decade, have been driven largely by advances in semiconductors. We've gotten better and better semiconductors that are more and more capable of cost-effectively training large AI systems. The trend has been in AI that the most advanced AI systems use twice as much data every 6 months, which means you need twice as much computing power to train the most advanced AI system every 6 months. And that's given rise to companies like NVIDIA, which not so long ago were known primarily for playing video games and now are used in AI training. That's the second thing. The third thing that's happened is the intensification of the geopolitical dynamics around semiconductors between China, the United States, and Taiwan. And Taiwan, of course, produces 90% of the most advanced chips. And every week that passes, there's more tension building in the China-Taiwan relationship and the China-US relationship, which has major impacts on semiconductor supply chains, especially the types of semiconductors that are used for AI.
So, focusing a bit on geopolitics, right? Because geopolitics obviously impact supply chains, as we have seen. I mean, at this point in time, we are sitting where the ships are not really getting into the Red Sea because of what's happening with the Houthis, et cetera, et cetera. It's all geopolitics, but that's obviously impacting supply chains and will start impacting them more the longer it continues. But talking about a bit on Taiwan, we are in a year when there are going to be lots and lots of elections, right? We have elections in Bangladesh today. The country is on fire. The next one, I think, is Taiwan. So what happens? I mean, in between Taiwan and China, the relationship at this point in time is a bit stressed. If it gets any worse, how do you see this whole semiconductor thing panning out?
Well, I think there are three big risks to the China-Taiwan-US relationship. They're China, Taiwan, and the United States. Yeah. Taiwan has elections this year, and it looks like the more pro-independence party is going to win. Now, the candidate has promised he won't declare independence, but his party's more pro-independence, and so China gets nervous. The US has elections this year, which, again, it's early stages still, but could impact the relationship with China. And then China itself has a much more opaque decision-making process. Though there are no elections for Xi Jinping, we know less and less as time passes about what's going on. And every time a defense minister is fired or a general disappears, uncertainty grows as to what's actually happening inside the halls of Zhongnanhai. And so I think in all three of those countries, there's a lot of risk to the relationship. And the problem is that today, nobody knows the exact state of the military balance. For most of the last 50 years, it was obvious that China couldn't succeed in taking Taiwan because the US had the military power to repel it. Today, nobody knows. If there was a war, who would win? The Pentagon runs war games, Research Institute runs war games, and half the time China wins, half the time the US wins. And that uncertainty is ultimately what's driving this concern that chip supply chains are centered on the island that is the epicenter of US-China competition.
So has there been some shift since the COVID meltdown to other countries, and of course India is seriously looking at how it builds its own capabilities. So where do you see the trend? What do you think is happening at this point in time?
I think the first trend is that basically every major economy, India, United States, Europe, Japan, they're all putting more government money behind semiconductors because manufacturers in all of these countries during the pandemic were shocked in many cases to find out that actually they didn't have semiconductor supply chains that were as reliable and resilient as they needed. So there is a push for a bit more regionalization in semiconductor supply chains, but the industry is so complex, so expensive, so technologically sophisticated that you can't do a complete regionalization. It's just too hard, too expensive. There's not a single country in the world that can produce advanced chips on its own, nor will there be a single country that can produce advanced chips on its own anytime in the foreseeable future. So the regionalization that's happening has to happen in a way that's economically efficient and technologically plausible. And right now, I think you see governments and companies trying to find the right balance between responding to the demands for more resilient supply chains, but also doing so in a way that isn't too costly or too disruptive that you actually slow the rate of technological progress. And I think for a lot of governments that have focused on semiconductors really for the first time in a long time, they've had to learn a lot about how the industry is structured, learn a lot about these far-flung international supply chains, learn a lot about technology that until recently governments didn't have to know too much about. So there's been a lot of learning going on in basically all of the world's major governments about how exactly these supply chains actually work.
And who's working with whom?
Well, I think
More important, who's not working with whom?
But the big shift is that 5 years ago, China was beginning to play a bigger and bigger role in the international supply chain. Today, China is not playing a bigger role in the international supply chain. China is playing a bigger role in building up its own supply chain. And so you've got a bifurcation that is, I think, gaining steam, where China is building more capabilities domestically, trying to do so autonomously, and at the same time, other countries like the United States, like Japan, are trying to cut China off from cutting-edge technologies. And so I think what we're going to have developing is that bifurcation will continue. China's going to get better and better at doing more on its own, but it'll still be behind the international supply chain, which is going to benefit from the fact that it can draw on the expertise of Japan and of Korea and of Taiwan and of the US and of India, all of whom are actually happy to have a supply chain that's less reliant on China for a variety of different reasons.
So you were telling me something very interesting, that of late, whenever you've gone to Taiwan, you haven't been able to meet a lot of people because many of them are in India.
That's right.
How do you see that marriage happening?
Well, I think there's
What are people in Taiwan saying?
Well, in Taiwan, I think there's two factors that are changing the China-Taiwan relationship and therefore the China-India relationship, the Taiwan-India relationship. One is that Taiwanese firms are looking at the Chinese market and saying, our prospect for future growth here is limited. The Chinese want to replace us. Anyway, the Chinese economy is slowing. They need to find new markets. And India, I think, is one of the biggest markets that they can approach. Second, Taiwanese firms are responding because other parts of the supply chain are saying, we want less reliance on China. And so if you listen to the big computer assemblers, for example, or the big smartphone assemblers that are non-Chinese, they're all asking their supply chains to develop more alternatives to Chinese suppliers. And India is a natural place to turn for design, for test and assembly, for device assembly, if you're trying to look to diversify from China. And so for the Taiwanese firms that actually do device assembly, that do a lot of the assembly and test of semiconductors, and that also do a lot of design, I think it's quite natural to turn to India as a source of that diversification.
And what are India's three core advantages and strengths that you see?
I think the advantages differ based on where you look in the supply chain. So if you start with chip design, for example, there are more people working in chip design in India than anywhere else in the world. So the labor force is just very, very deep, which is why there already are a lot of multinational firms with offices in India. And we heard just this morning the news from Qualcomm setting up a facility in Tamil Nadu. And I think that's not a surprise to hear that. And Taiwanese firms, Taiwanese chip design firms see the same thing. If you look at other parts of the supply chain, like the assembly and test of semiconductors, there are different assets that India has. The growth in the electronics ecosystem, for example, in this state, is going to contribute, I think, to more interest in assembly and test. Finally, if you look at certain types of semiconductors, you'll find that there's a desire in the auto industry, for example, and medical devices to have more confidence that your semiconductor supply chains are nearby. And so whether it's the Indian auto industry or the North American auto industry, I hear more and more companies that say, we want to have local suppliers. And I think for companies in India that are selling into Indian manufacturing supply chains, that's a real opportunity.
So you talked about China and its efforts to become self-sufficient in terms of its own supply chains, etc. So interestingly, and from technology point of view, because I mean the general view is that China is way ahead in certain technologies. We're still doing a lot of catching up to do over there. And that, if I remember correctly, that Huawei came out with a phone which had a chip that sort of surprised the world and said, oh my God, right? And of late, Huawei came out with a laptop and everybody opened it and saw a Taiwan chip in it. So what is missing here?
Well, I think we swing between two different extremes on China. There are some people who think China is going to take over the world technologically, and others think China is never going to make any progress. And the reality is somewhere in between. There are very impressive companies in China. Huawei is a great example. A company that's really had tremendous technological progress over the last 2 decades, won tremendous market share as a result. But the reality is, if you dig into the semiconductor supply chain in China, you see a whole lot of imported expertise, software, machine tools, materials. And so it's true China is getting more self-sufficient, but it's getting more self-sufficient from a very low base. And most of the chips manufactured in China are still manufactured using imported tools, imported materials, imported chemicals. That doesn't mean we're not going to see more self-sufficiency. That's the policy goal. China's spending more money than the rest of the world combined each year to achieve self-sufficiency, and they're going to get some results from that. But that doesn't mean they're going to catch up to the cutting edge right away, just because the cutting edge is so hard to catch up to.
So in India, for a long, there's been a fascination with fab. Everybody sort of wants to get into that instead of starting slow. What kind of a journey India still needs to make?
Well, I think I would say a couple of things. First off is that political leaders around the world like fabrication. Fabs are big buildings. They cost hundreds of millions or tens of billions of dollars in many cases. And ribbon cutting ceremonies in front of fabs are great for politicians in the US, in Europe, in Japan, everywhere. And I think there's good reasons for countries to want to have a fabrication base, but there's also good reasons to be wary of over-indexing on fabrication. Because there's great value in supply chains in other parts of the value chain. In design, for example, there's more money made in chip design each year than there is in fabrication. Most people don't realize that. And so I think that in general, political leaders, when they think about the chip industry, they focus insufficiently on design and they focus too much on manufacturing. The second thing is that because fabrication is so expensive, you've got to ask yourself, do I have a comparative advantage in spending hundreds of millions or billions of dollars? And some countries might have a comparative advantage there, but it's actually hard to have a comparative advantage in spending money. And so I think in general, governments should be wary, should be skeptical of the idea that actually spending a lot of money on fabrication is the best strategy. It could be in certain circumstances for certain purposes, but your marginal dollar is probably best spent in other parts of the supply chain.
So you think India is well placed in the journey it's starting to make?
Well, I think I would say a couple of things there. First, I'm very impressed by the scope of investment across the supply chain in India. I think the anecdote about me visiting Taiwan and everyone I know in Taiwan being in India tells you everything you need to know. That's where Taiwanese executives are spending time. That's where Taiwanese investments are being made. That's a good sign. I think second, the amount of focus on capitalizing on the number of Indians working worldwide in the chip industry and bringing that expertise together is also something that I find very impressive. And the fact that you have Indians working in Malaysia and in Singapore and in the US and in Europe is a talent pool that can be drawn on and is being drawn on. I think that's also very positive. And third is the shift in electronics supply chains writ large. I mean, it's happening. Apple has basically said they want to make fewer iPhones in China and more iPhones in India, and they're not alone. All the PC manufacturers are doing the same thing. Samsung already migrated all of its phone assembly out of China. And phone assembly is not semiconductor manufacturing, they're different, but they're correlated. And it's not a coincidence that Taiwan started with device assembly, then slowly moved up the value chain. And I think that's a path that other countries can take too.
So interestingly, during the inaugural, Tamil Nadu launched its semiconductor policy. Not sure if any of you have seen what the policy is about, because it was just going to be uploaded, but we were having a conversation with the CEO of Guidance just before we stepped into the room, and interestingly, he just gave some very little information, but valuable information. Does that work in terms of subsidizing payrolls?
Well, I think for the design...
So what he said was that one of the key components was subsidizing the payrolls for semiconductor industry, and people are going to invest in here by about 30%. So we need to check that, but that's what he said.
And for chip design
for chip design
yes.
specifically, yeah. Specifically for chip design.
I think that's a plausible strategy. I think there's a lot of competition around the world as to who gets investments in chip design. There's a lot of places, not just around the world, but in India, where you can set up a chip design center. And so governments, if they want to win market share, if they want to win new facilities, incentives are part of what you need. That's just the reality. You might like a free market, but the market is not free because every other government is subsidizing too. That's how the world works.
Okay. So I will ask my last question, and then I'd love to open it up for you guys. And the last question is, what kind of regulatory frameworks or guidelines do you think are necessary to govern the development and use of AI-powered semiconductor technology, ensuring responsible innovation and deployment?
Well, I think right now the answer is we don't know, because we barely have a sense of how AI will actually be deployed. Right now we have experiments with AI, but there really aren't AI products yet, except for ChatGPT, which is, it's more of a toy than it is a real product. And that's not to insult it, but we're in the very, very early stage of AI deployment. So I think governments right now are trying to understand, and companies are trying to understand, what would one want to regulate, and if so, how would you do it? Now, there's a couple of different ways you can regulate. One, you can regulate the people who are producing AI products. Two, you can regulate people who are providing the compute that AI training and inference requires. And I think both of those are routes that governments are going to look at taking. There's challenges in both of them. But in any new sphere like AI, it's going to take governments a long time to develop the expertise, to develop the understanding needed to begin the process, which is why I think that the regulation that will actually matter is the regulation that big tech companies roll out first, because that's actually going to impact how our products developed, how is AI deployed, and I think that's the regulation we should be following most closely for now.
Thank you, Chris. Questions, ladies and gentlemen? Please, gentleman in red shirt. Can we have a mic, please? Can somebody get a mic here? Or you can take this one. Let me give this to you. Yeah, it works. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Madhusudan. I'm the founding CEO of Incor. We are India's only processor startup. We compete with ARM and other RISC-V companies. Now,
just speak a bit louder.
Yeah, my name is Madhusudan. I'm the founding CEO of Incor, India's only RISC-V processor IP startup among the 6 or 8 in the world. Now, everybody talks about Indian design, but the problem is we've always been designing based on specs that have come from elsewhere on the planet. Product conceptualization is not an Indian strength. And there is an absolute lack of, say, VPs of marketing over here. So transitioning from designing to somebody else's spec to taking a leap of faith and saying, I'm going to take a gut feel on this product. That's why Apple succeeded, right? Not just because of the engineering process, and you can't do customer surveys. Ultimately, it's an act of faith. And we don't have brand companies selling products. How do we get to that? Transition from design to products is a huge chasm. I think everybody is underestimating that effort grossly.
I think you're absolutely right to identify that problem. I think if you look historically, what you find is that there is a pathway. And it's a pathway that has been followed by companies in Japan, in Korea, and in Taiwan. So if you ask yourself, what role did Korea play in electronic supply chains 50 years ago? It played a tiny, low-value role. What role does it play today? Well, Samsung is an extraordinarily important player in electronics, and it's a brand that's recognized globally. And so that's a path that develops over time. I think you shouldn't underestimate how long it takes, just because in the Korean case, in the Taiwanese case, and in the Japanese case, it took a decade or 2 decades to begin to develop those capabilities. So it's not going to happen overnight. But I think it's also not going to happen unless you have an ecosystem that exists. And that's what you have to build over time. And an ecosystem is not just one company. It's a pipeline of talent. It's people going between companies and learning different skill sets. And I think you're right to point out as well, it's not just engineering talent. Engineering talent is actually probably the easy part relative to the business acumen that you need to match technology to market.
Next question. That's off. You need to put it on.
Hi, Chris. Here. Yeah, I'm Manjunath from Semtronics Microsystems, Bangalore. We are a power management IC company. I just wanted to know from you, what would be your suggestions to the government, whether to go into cutting-edge technology nodes, say in few nanometers, or into the legacy products, which are already being used in the country?
Well, I think I don't know that I'd have I think you'd want to do your market mapping first. So I'd let the government do the market mapping there. I think the key question is, if you're gonna, is how are you going to differentiate yourself from what's already on the market? That's the key question. That's true for any company. Yeah. And so when I talk to governments, that are trying to break into a different part of the semiconductor value chain, the question I ask is, well, what's your differentiating factor? How are you going to compete? Are you going to compete on cost? Are you going to compete on product quality? Are you going to serve a market niche that isn't already there? And I think that's a question that I would start by asking. Is there a market in India that's not being fully served? Possibly so. I think what you wouldn't want to do is compete in something that's already being commoditized and produced globally without a strategy to do it better or lower cost or more effectively. And I do worry, this is not a comment about India per se, but about governments in general. When governments get involved in industries, they often don't have all the market knowledge you need. And that's a real challenge. You've got to be very careful, I think, in making sure you develop the market knowledge, that you deploy your funds in the most effective manner.
Thank you.
Hi, Chris. I have two questions.
Could you introduce yourself?
My name is Kaja. I am one of the finance executives from Semiconductor. I've lived in Semiconductor for 20 years. So I'm just following your trend on Taiwan. I have two specific questions on Taiwan. One, we talk about this political tension. What is the root cause of it? I mean, let's just spell it out, because there is so much going on around the globe. We need to understand, based on your experience, what is the root cause of Taiwan's role in the whole semiconductor world? That's one. Second, it's more related to India and Taiwan. It's beautiful, like all the relationships, collaborations which are happening. Taiwan has certain sustainable competitive advantages. What are they? Compared to India, do we even have a shot at it in the longer run? Because all these political tensions that we talk about may go away temporarily. But what are going to be our sustainable advantages that we need to target to have a shot at competing with Taiwan?
Well, I would say, competing head-on with Taiwan is a dangerous game to play. And I wouldn't recommend it, but nor do I think that's what India is actually trying to do. As I understand the strategy of different Indian companies, of different parts of the Indian government, the goal is not to compete head-on with Taiwan or TSMC. And I think that's the right goal, is to not do that, but rather to collaborate. And to me, it seems there's a lot of interest in Taiwan in exactly that type of collaboration, whether it's in assembly and test, whether it's in device assembly, whether down the road it's in fabrication, whether it's in design. There's certainly interest in design collaboration as well. And so I think that's the right way to conceptualize the India-Taiwan semiconductor relationship. And I think the opening ceremony today had one example of that. There's a number of Taiwanese firms in this state who are investing not in a competitive relationship, but quite the contrary, in a collaborative one.
Hi, Chris. My name is Sridharan Mani. I'm from a company called Agisa Digital Innovations. We are a fabless semiconductor. We are designing semiconductor chips in Chennai. I've read your Chip Wars book, fantastic book. I really enjoyed reading it. But one thing I noticed is there was no mention about India in the entire book. It was coming somewhere at the end. Of course, we had some design works. So if you were to write Chip Wars 2 tomorrow, where do you see India in that?
I would have an entire chapter on Tamil Nadu. I think if you ask me the question, if I were to write Chip War in 20 years, or Chip War 2 in 20 years, would there be a bigger role for India? My guess is that the answer would be yes.
Thank you.
So time for two more questions. Anybody else? Yes, that hand, gentleman or lady, please. You need a mic. Can somebody get a mic to her, please? There's a mic to your left.
Hi, Chris. This is Shobha Rangrajan. I'm a tough Salem living in Chennai, Go Jumbos. So my question is, do you think that there will be enough talent, or how do you grow talent in India for developing fabs? Because we do design here, but we don't have that much talent for operating fabs in India, like China and Taiwan. What do you suggest we do?
So I think the best way to develop fab talent is to have fabs. That's basically the dynamic. Right now in the US, where there are a fair number of fabs, but there's a major process of building a lot of new fabs subsidized by the government, there are incredible workforce shortages in a whole variety of different spheres. And if you talk to companies and say, well, why are there workforce shortages? Companies will say, well, we haven't had to hire anyone in this sphere for decades because you haven't built fabs in a very long time. And so I think if you want the workforce, you've got to actually invest in the companies that will hire the workforce.
Opinion,
there are several open source infrastructure has been developed for designing chips and everything else. But how will you think the fabs will accommodate those open source ecosystem? Whether the fabs will open up their processes for easier development of chips in futures?
Well, I think it's a totally different challenge talking about open source for design versus open source for fabrication. And fabrication companies have a very strong incentive not to be too open about their processes. I think there is, however, a fair amount of push to make it easier for smaller companies to get access to fabrication, at least for test runs and prototyping. And I think that's a place where actually governments and academic institutions have to play a role in making sure that foundry capacity is open enough for smaller firms, not only for the big firms, but for smaller firms that want to test a new chip or test a new product, see if it'll work, and then try to grow after that. But I think that's the most openness one can realistically hope for in the manufacturing process.
Well, thank you. I think we're running out of time. I'm getting one more question. I can? Okay, lovely. Gentlemen, your question, your turn.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
I'm Ranjit Dash from Realtek Semiconductors, Taiwan, and leading a delegation of semiconductor experts here. My question to Chris, assuming that I'm a representative of government, assume that I'm Prime Minister, and we see that a lot of Indian companies are courting Taiwanese companies to come in and do the fab in India. Let's say that doesn't happen. And me being the head of the government want really badly this to happen. I employ you as a consultant. So tell me how this can be done with China, and I mean, India is in the crossroads that China was 20 years ago, with the hindsight of whatever had happened, whatever went, what was in their favor, what was against in their favor. Now we have our own play. So please advise what can be done and how it can be done.
Chris, you just got offered a job. So you must negotiate the salary before you respond.
I think the first thing I would tell the Prime Minister is success or failure is not determined by the number of fabs you have. Right? There are currently hardly any chips made in California. Most of the money in the chip industry goes to companies in California. And that is just fundamentally important to keep in mind. And so I think I would start with that basic fact, and then you can reason backwards about how would you like to make your money. But I think if you look at where does economic value flow, it flows to companies that in many cases don't actually manufacture chips. And so I don't think we should over-index on the manufacturing as opposed to the rest of the value chain, all of which is also very important.
Which is what you said earlier. Right, so thank you. Thank you for your time and patience. And Chris is going to be speaking tomorrow again. He'll have a keynote speech, so most welcome to join. He's obviously going to talk something different than what we had a conversation about. We did agree on that one. So thank you once again.